Many of you know or do have the experience that we used oral targeted therapies in sarcomas for the last 20 years, especially in GIST. That means patients are taking their medications as tablets or capsules. And here's the important that patients take their pills regularly because, as you know, medication will not work in patients that don't take their medication. That's a very simple idea. But the question is, as we have seen now, can we show have you taken your pill today? So the question is really, does this happen always, that the patient is taking his pill or taking his medication, especially when patients experience enormous side effects or need necessary support of the healthcare team, and this support maybe is missing for the patient. Medication adherence is defined by the World Health Organization as the degree to which the person's behavior corresponds with the agreed recommendations of the healthcare provider. I think that's the definition. And some of you maybe know the topic of compliance or adherence. Very often we use the term of compliance, but we will hear in some minutes about what is compliance and what is adherence. So adherence to therapies is a primary determinant of treatment success. Failure to adherence is a serious problem which not only affects the patient but also the healthcare system. Medication non-adherence in patient leads to substantial worsening of disease, sometimes progression, but also death and increased healthcare costs. And a variety of factors are likely to affect adherence. So adherence, specifically for oral therapies, is a main issue, a main topic, and a very complex topic. And that's why it's our great pleasure now to introduce Professor Rob Horne from the UCL, the London School of Pharmacy in London. We know each other now for around about 10 years, I think. And Professor Horne is exactly working on this topic, on adherence, compliance. So that means the role of psychological and behavioral factors in explaining variation in response to treatment. Rob, it's a great pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much, Marcus, for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I must apologize also that I have to leave shortly after the talk, just in case you don't like it. Yeah, I have another talk in Paris, and when I told my daughter that I'm going to Dublin and Paris, she said, wow, what a charmed life you lead. But actually, little does she realize I get about 4 hours in each city. So a great pleasure to be here. And I'm talking on understanding perceptions to address adherence, or understanding the causes of non-adherence. And I look with slight horror at my presentation now, because I think I've inadvertently sent an earlier version, but it's okay, it'll have most of the stuff in it. And I was going to start with an agenda. And what and also some disclosures, which the slide isn't there. But my agenda really is I want to show you the scale of the problem of non-adherence, including in oral treatments for cancer, and then look at the causes. Why does it occur from the patient's perspective? And outline some of the science around understanding patients' perspectives, and then come on to solutions. How can we develop solutions that help patients to get the best from good medicines? So we have an issue with adherence. This cartoon illustrates the development of medicines, right? Each medicine can cost billions of dollars to develop and takes 10 to 12 years. And that's like carving a piano out of solid rock, when you think of it in terms of the human achievement. Well, that gets us to the fifth box, and then it all goes horribly wrong when we give it to people to use, because there is a gap between really good medicines and optimal outcomes. And that gap is a behavioral gap often. And it's the behavior of three parties, individuals. Patients, as Marcus has already said, have to take it properly to get the right effect, but also it has to be prescribed properly. Then at the next level, there are organizational issues. Does the organization deliver the medicine in the right way? Does it provide the right support so that the patient can get the best from it? And then thirdly, societal policy. Do we make the medicine available in a way that patients can afford and engage with? So these are all behavioral issues which might limit the impact of a medicine. What I'm talking about today is the first topic, and it's individuals and in particular patients, okay? So patient adherence. Now, non-adherence or non-compliance, as it's sometimes called, I think most people now use adherence because compliance has a negative connotation, okay? It's kind of based on an idea that's implicit, that it's the doctor's job to find the right treatment and prescribe it and issue the instructions, and it's the patient's job to follow the instructions. And that can lead to a sort of idea that when a patient is non-compliant, there's a bit of an element of blame. Why do these crazy patients not do what's good for them? So in order to try and get away from that idea, which you'll see from the rest of my talk is completely wrong, people coined a different term. It means the same thing, but non-adherence is an effort to emphasize that it is the patient's right to choose not to take the medicine, and that non-adherence should never be a reason to blame the patient, because as you will see, it is not usually the patient's fault. And WHO, in a classic review, estimated that half of all medicines prescribed for long-term conditions are not taken as advised. And if the prescription was appropriate, if we assume the prescription was right, that damages three stakeholders: patients, because they lose the opportunity for health gain; the healthcare system that is paying for the medicine because it's wasted medicine, but that's only the small bit. The actual biggest impact is on the knock-on effects of non-adherence, where patients then need more intensive tests because the doctor is wondering why the medicine isn't working. It's because they're not taking it, but they have to do more tests, and they may even escalate to more expensive therapies. But also then you have the knock-on costs when the patient's condition fails to benefit from the treatment. And thirdly, the pharma industry, which invests in developing the medicines, but then doesn't get the return on investment because either the patient doesn't take the right amount of medicine, or much more commonly and problematically, we have non-persistence, which is where the patient decides on their own to stop taking the medicine. And that is a huge issue right across the board. So it's a big problem, and if the prescription was right and the medicine's a good one, all three stakeholders are damaged by non-adherence. Yet we're not very good at dealing with it, because effective interventions are difficult to find. As a whole series of systematic reviews beginning in the Lancet in the 90s that asked a simple question: across therapeutic areas, how effective are interventions to increase adherence? And the answer is not very. About half work, but even those that work don't have very big effects and they don't last very long. And one of the key reasons for that is that when you dig a bit deeper, very few of those interventions have started with an understanding of the patient's perspective. Why don't patients take medicines? A lot of the interventions are developed based on assumptions about why they don't, rather than based on good quality research involving patients to understand this issue in detail. So what I want to do now is try and present an outline of some of that research. I've been doing this for about 25 years. And I'll start with explaining the scale of the problem. Then I'll go on to summarizing research, understanding why it happens, and then move on to some solutions which are based on that research, which have been tested and are now things that we can start implementing. So the first thing to realize, non-adherence is 3 behaviors, right? You have to start taking a medicine. This is entirely obvious, but it's worth thinking about. You have to start doing it, then you have to do it properly. So that's initiation is starting, execution is following the recommendations, and then you have to keep doing it for as long as the medicine's needed, sometimes for life. And stuff goes wrong at all 3 of those points. You get primary non-adherence, people don't even start. You get what we've called, what we often call non-adherence, but it's actually all 3, is when the patient may take some of the medicine, but not all. They take it in the wrong way or on the wrong time, or they miss out doses. And then you've got this huge problem of non-persistence, right? But none of this is an issue in cancer, is it? Well, the answer is it is, because when you start looking at cancer treatments, you still get variation in adherence. So adjuvant endocrine therapy adherence rates across studies vary 15 to 73%. You rarely get 100%. In oral chemotherapy, 40 to 100%. And in other oral anti-cancer agents, 69 to 100%. And there are studies, we won't go into detail, but they consistently show low adherence rates. Not as low as 50%, but usually between 20 and 30% non-adherence, even for cancer treatments. Imatinib was one of the new generation cancer treatments, wasn't it? And then a study that was done, I think it was over 10 years ago, 13 years ago, looked at adherence to imatinib and found that actually patients could be categorized according to adherence. And about 20%, over 20%, over 25% had low adherence. They took less than 90% of the medicine, with dire consequences, because those patients with lower adherence were significantly less likely to get a complete molecular response, which means the drug didn't work in the patients who had low adherence. And you needed quite high levels of adherence to get the effect. And this was a sample of data from that study. This is just one patient, and you can see what's going on. The green are where the patient takes the medicine every day, and the 0 or yellow boxes are where they miss out doses. So they start off with high adherence, and then it gradually tails off. And there are lots, that's a very common factor, and there are lots of patterns. But what this illustrates is right from the kind of early days of, if you like, the new generation of anti-cancer treatments, we still see evidence of non-adherence. We don't need to look at this. Another challenge is that there are racial inequalities in outcome in cancer treatments, and this is data showing lower rates of adherence in Black women compared to other ethnic groups for endocrine therapy in cancer. Now, what is going on there? Is it that Black people are inherently different or less adherent? No, it's not a trait characteristic feature. There is something in the delivery or experience of the care which is not going as well for Black patients as it does for white. So we've just got a grant to look into this in London for both prostate cancer and breast cancer, because we understand little about the causes of this disparity. So that's a huge challenge for us. Other key challenges. The first one is there is no such thing as the non-adherent patient. Or if there is, it's all of you and me. Because adherence rates vary not just between patients, but within the same individual over time and across treatments. How many of you have ever had a medicine you haven't taken properly? Okay, wow, that's a low percentage. Usually it's over half, right? Most of us are non-adherent some of the time, And it's almost the norm rather than the exception. But the thing that this data tells us is it's not something about the individual. That's like a trait, a personality, or a socioeconomic thing, or a gender thing, or a race thing. Because people can be adherent to one treatment and not to others. So we have to understand this in terms of the interaction between a given individual and a particular illness and treatment. So that's a big challenge for us, right? How do we do that? The second is that there is an information action gap in medicine. A lot of what we try to do to support adherence is give people information, right? And improve their knowledge. But there is a gap. Information does not guarantee the behavior. So we need to understand fundamentally what is in that gap. A recent review of causes, like proven causes, correlates of non-adherence across illnesses, came up with over 700 different correlates. So what I'd like to do now is just go through each of those in turn, and then we'll work out what to do. Now that clearly, that's not that helpful. So what we need is a model or a framework for understanding how those different causes might impact on an individual. And then we can start to think about how we can intervene to address this fundamental problem. And this is a simple model that we developed, which is included in the NICE guidance for adherence. And it's called the Perceptions and Practicalities Approach, or PAPA for short. And what it says is, look, all of those reasons for non-adherence boil down into two basic causes. There are two reasons why people don't take medicines. They can't, or they don't want to. Now that is so obvious that you're wondering, why on earth did this guy get a professorship? And I think the same myself, right? So obviously I had to complicate it a little bit. But actually, failure to really understand that and implement it in terms of how we support patients is why we have such a massive problem with non-adherence. Can't, don't want to. So if we dig a little bit deeper into that and look at the right-hand side in the orange circle, non-adherence can be unintentional when the person wants to do it, but they can't because of barriers beyond their control. They forget, they can't afford it. It's difficult to build a routine, right? The instructions are too complicated. They can't handle the dosage form. These are all practical issues which reduce the person's ability to take it. They want to, but they can't. And most of what we do, if you think about it, to support adherence is in this orange circle. We might issue reminders, we might help patients plan, we give them clear instructions and information, we try and make the dosage as convenient and easy to use as possible. All of this is really good stuff. But the problem is it doesn't work for many people. It helps, but it doesn't address the problem, because much of the non-adherence and pretty much all of the non-persistence is not because the person can't, it's because they don't want to. And to understand that, we need to understand why someone would decide that it's not a good idea to take or continue to take a medicine. Right? Now that's the fundamental challenge in non-adherence. And for you as clinicians or patients interested in cancer, why would someone with cancer decide that it's not a good idea for them to take the treatment? And until we can get a view on that and understand how we might intervene, we're not going to get very far. So this circle, the blue circle, is about understanding motivation and the beliefs, emotions, and sometimes background biases which might lead us to think it's not a good idea to take a medicine. Okay? So now obviously this simple motivation and ability thing is really focused from the individual. Of course, There are environmental factors, right? Things like people have to have the opportunity to take it. It has to be available to them. If the medicine is so expensive that they can't afford it, even if they could manage the regimen, they are not given the opportunity, okay? Triggers are also important. That's the FOG behavioral model, how your behavior is triggered, what makes you do something. Things like the quality of the communication with the healthcare provider, social support, all of these things are really important in adherence, but they have to act via the individual's motivation and/or their ability. So understanding an individual's motivation and ability remains at the core of non-adherence. And if you're developing a program to support patients and help them to get the best from medicine, those are the first two questions that you need to ask about it. Will this program impact on the patient's motivation, and will it impact on their ability? So those are the key ingredients. Now let's look in that blue circle in a bit more detail and look at treatment beliefs, because these, based on the research evidence, are really the missing link in adherence. And we need to understand how people really think about illness and treatment, and how that determines behavior, like adherence, but also it directly determines recovery. But I'm not going to talk much about that today. Now, what I'm going to say is based on probably 25 years of scientific research involving understanding and measuring patients' beliefs about treatment. And we have a validated approaches for doing that. But I'm not going to talk about the science behind how do we know what someone's beliefs are. But I hope you'll just believe me that the science is there, and there are valid ways in which we can understand people's beliefs and how they vary, and we can quantify it. We can put numbers to it and do research on it. So it's all based on that approach. And there are two key beliefs that we need to understand, which will determine whether a patient, and including you or I, think it's a good idea to take a medicine or not. And it's a framework called necessity concerns, and it's at the core of the NICE medicines adherence guidelines, but it's not very commonly used in practice by the industry or what have you, okay? So let's try and understand these two beliefs. Firstly, necessity. A necessity belief is not the same as believing that something will be beneficial or effective. Rather, it's the answer to two questions that we ask ourselves. One, how much do I really need to do this to achieve something that is important to me? And the second question is, can I get away without doing it? And we can have a belief about efficacy and benefit whilst not really perceiving a strong personal need. I'll give you an example. I think I would benefit from running 5K every morning. And I think that would be really effective in making me fitter and slimmer, right? So I've got strong beliefs about that, but I don't do it. I do run maybe 3 times a week, if I'm lucky. But if you give me more information about the benefits and efficacy of running, it's not going to change me, because I don't think I need to run 7 times a week. I think I can get away with it 3 times a week. But also, I'm not sure how good an idea it is to run 7 days a week. I've got some concerns, because when I did that last, I got an injury and then I couldn't run for ages, right? So unless you start addressing my necessity belief in the first instance, how much do I need to do this? Can I get away without doing it? I'm never going to run if you just give me more and more information about efficacy and benefit. Now, if you think about how we communicate medicines to patients, it's usually about efficacy and benefit, right? And many patients don't take medicines because they have a doubt in their personal need. The answer to that question, how much do I really need to do this to achieve something that's important to me is equivocal, or I don't think I do need to take it. And can I get away without doing it? Yes, I can. Most of the non-persistence is because the patient reaches a point where they think, I'm not sure that I really need to keep doing this, and I think I can get away without doing it. And even when you do decide on the necessity of the treatment, I have a strong personal need to keep taking this, your concerns then become more salient, right? It's the reason we ask the second question, can I get away without doing it? Because if medicines were chocolate with no risk of damaging your teeth or putting on weight, most people, if they had to take a bar a day, would just go, great, why not? Okay, the concerns are not there. But with medicines, most people think about them as having harm or danger attached to them, as well as potential benefit, right? So there's a balance between these. And this program this framework is really well validated. So here are some examples of the concerns that people have. They go well beyond side effects. This is just showing data from one study in inflammatory bowel disease. I know that's not the topic in question, but when you look at the cancer studies, they show similar things. And what this is illustrating is that concerns go way beyond side effects. Concerns about side effects are really important, but this data is showing the percentage of patients, and over 1,000 of them, who agree or strongly agree with each of the statements going down the left-hand side. So about a third say, you see about halfway there, a third say the medicines cause unpleasant side effects. But by far the most common concerns are at the top, are based on beliefs, right? Like, I worry about long-term effects. If I keep putting this chemical into my body over the long term, what's that doing? Right? Are there hidden effects that no one knows about? This idea that you keep putting it in over years, and it's a chemical, that is a concern for 73% of patients in this study. It's very similar across other conditions that we've studied. And then other concerns, if you take it regularly, will it be less effective in future? General worries about taking medicines, right? So they're often based on these common beliefs about the harm of medicines. And, non-adherence is strongly associated with doubts about necessity and concerns about potential harm. It's not just side effects, it's potential harm. And here's an example from a breast cancer study where this was a qualitative study, but using the framework. And you can see, look, some patients, some ideas reinforce necessity. Well, since the option is to keep taking it or be dead, it's not much of a choice, right? But others reinforce concerns. I absolutely hate taking this tablet. It's a very powerful drug. It's not just the side effects, it's a reminder of what I had. Right? So the meaning of the medication, we see this in lots of research in women who are offered hormone therapy. They will say, I've just been given the all clear. I've had radiotherapy and chemotherapy. Now they're asking me to take a medicine for 5 to 10 years. And doing that is a potent reminder of something they would like to leave behind. I'd like to forget about cancer and get on with my life, right? So the way in which that medicine is presented is usually not very good in respect of making a case for necessity and addressing patients' concerns. Here are some examples of how people think about medicines. This is for anti-TNF medication in things like psoriasis and rheumatoid arthritis. This was a revolutionary treatment, very transformative, really improves symptoms, and patients can feel the difference, right? Makes a huge difference very quickly. But look how some of these patients are thinking about it. I love seeing my symptoms 90% gone, but I worry about taking such a strong drug and what it's doing to my body. So there's this idea that the stronger the drug, the more harmful. How many people would have that idea in the back of their mind? The more the stronger it is, the more harmful, right? That idea goes back a long way. So the ancient Greeks had one word for medicine and poison: pharmakon. That's where we get pharmacy and pharmaceuticals, right? Medicine, poison. Dermatologists today are too quick to prescribe medicines that have short-term positive effects on your skin while creating long-term catastrophic effects on your body. It doesn't, but this, and the short-term effects are really marked. You can really see it. I sit there and think, I take so many and all those chemicals in my body, I blow up like a toxic bomb. What are they doing inside you? I stopped taking anti-TNF because other patients mentioned cancer in online fora, right? And these are just examples of typical beliefs and ideas that people have about medicines, which impinge on this necessity concern evaluation, which they do. And so just a little bit more about what I call common sense defaults, right? So when you actually step inside the patient's shoes and look at the treatment and the illness from their point of view, what's emerging from this, I would hope, it certainly strikes me, is that patients' ideas are maybe misplaced from a medical perspective, because most medicines don't have these long-term effects. And it doesn't necessarily follow that the stronger the drug, the more side effects, but they are very logical, right? They're very logical. And another example of where doubts about necessity come from is related to the way in which people think about illness. And I call these common sense defaults. Common sense defaults are ways in which we think about illness and treatment, which are often not revealed to doctors in consultations, but they have a powerful effect on our willingness to take medicine. And if common sense defaults are not identified and addressed, they will tend to lead the patient to think it's not a good idea to continue to take this. So the first common sense default is the idea of the need for fit between the patient's beliefs or understanding of the problem, the condition, and the solution, the medicine. They have to fit together. And often they don't. Just telling patients how the medicines work or how to take it is not enough. We need to tell a story in a way that overcomes common sense defaults, in the way that people think about medicines. So I'll give you some examples of these common sense defaults, see if you recognize them. First one, I don't feel any better, right? I've been taking this medicine for 8 weeks and I don't feel any better, right? Now, most of our experience of illness before we get a serious condition or a long-term one is symptomatic and episodic. We know when we're ill, we feel ill. Few of us keep taking paracetamol after the headache's gone, right? Only the more cautious. And so our idea is often you take the treatment, you feel better, you stop taking the treatment. And that's a really strong common sense background idea. Also, if I miss out a few doses and nothing bad happens, I don't feel any worse, that can make me think, well, I'm not sure how important this medicine really is. Maybe my body has had enough of it now to do the job, right? So often our way in which we evaluate medicines is based on symptoms, and we have expectations of the symptoms. And two people may have very different expectations. One's thinking, I'm going to feel the benefit really quickly. The other one's thinking, I may not feel any benefit at all. We have to understand the expectation in relation to symptoms and try and preempt that. Disease prototypes and stereotypes. What do you think is happening on the right-hand side, the left-hand side? Anyone tell me what's happening to that patient? Any ideas? Sorry? A heart attack? Or? Angina pectoris. Oh, angina pectoris, yeah. So an angina attack, okay? What often people will say is a heart attack, right? a myocardial infarction, and that is a public prototype of a myocardial infarction. Most people think a heart attack, pain in their heart going down the left-hand side and collapse. We did a study about 15 years ago that showed that very few patients experienced a heart attack in that way. And in fact, if you expected to experience it that way and you didn't, you had a significantly greater delay to call the emergency services, right? So what is our prototype of the condition? The other thing is stereotypes. That's our beliefs about what sort of person gets this condition and how much do I resemble them. So if you're trying to persuade a young woman not to smoke by saying, look, if you smoke, it increases your risk of a heart attack, that may be less salient to her if she thinks the sort of people who get heart attacks are overweight, stressed, older males. Okay, so two other ideas that we carry around, stereotypes and prototypes. Prototypes of cancer originally might be fatalism and fear. Cancer, as I understand it now, is a very wide range of conditions with different treatments and very different outcomes. But in public perception, cancer is often one condition, and it often has a very bleak outlook. Okay, so we might need to challenge some of those preconceptions about cancer. Also around the idea of a long-term oral treatment for cancer. Cancer is treated acutely, radiotherapy, chemotherapy, very intensive treatment, and then it's gone, right? But of course, with endocrine therapy, there is now a tendency towards longer treatments, etc. Okay? Keep dropping this. So we need to understand those. Other common sense default, chemicals bad, natural good. Does that look familiar? Yeah, okay. So when we talk about medicines, patients often see them as chemical, and that's dangerous. The other common sense default is we avoid danger before going for gain, right? That's a sort of implicit human bias, right? Now, when you first get a medicine and you open the patient information leaflet, as an EU regulation, it has to list everything that could possibly go wrong, right? Now, that is good. We need to inform people about what could go wrong, but actually there's another side of it which has a bad impact on many patients. In some of the interviews I've done with patients, I've asked people, why don't you take the medicine? And they say, well, would you? And I go, yeah, I probably would. Why? What do you think? And she goes, well, look, I read the leaflet, and in that it lists this, this, and this, and there's no way I want to get that, so I'm not going to take it. So there's, again, an implicit logic. How do you avoid getting all those horrible things? Don't put it in your body. And especially if you're not that convinced that you really need it long term, you might go with that. What we really should, that's the equivalent of me saying to you, look, when you leave the building, be careful because you could slip on the stairs and break a leg, you could fall over and get run over by a taxi, or a slate from the roof could, give you concussion, right? After a while of listing all those things, you probably think it's a good idea to stay in the room, even if you have to listen to me for longer, right? And we do this with patients. So you don't get much support after the initial discussions of a medicine in most healthcare systems. What you then have is the leaflet. And that's the time people look at it, then they might go online. Oh dear, then it starts to get really dodgy. Okay, so that's also a problem. We tend to try and avoid the negatives rather than go for the positive. And here are some examples. I've talked about these beliefs, right? So we don't need to do this. So what we need to understand, the key to understanding non-adherence, is to take a patient-centered approach. We have to get inside the patient's mind, stand inside their shoes, and look at the treatment through their eyes, right? Because two identical people can have very different ideas about the treatment. So if we try and profile in terms of gender, socio-educational status, income, any of those things, personality, it's not going to help us that much. These are traditional approaches. What counts is what's in the person's mind, and that is not determined by those factors. And disconnects drive non-adherence often. The way in which the patient is thinking about the treatment, their knowledge, beliefs, and expectations are often very different from the clinicians. But it doesn't get revealed in the brief consultations that we have. So how are we going to fix this, right? What on earth do we do? It's looking a bit complicated. But here are some solutions, some of which are now tried and tested. They're all pretty new because this is an emerging and developing field, but I want to give you some examples. So obviously, we need to just bear in mind as a caveat that our intervention should take account of all three. This is called the lollipop, right? All three circles. We need good healthcare system policies. We need to make medicines accessible and affordable. We need good patient-provider interactions, right? They need support from healthcare providers. But actually, the core of this is how do we connect with the patient? Because they're the ones that really count, and it's their behavior which is crucial. So I'm going to talk about patient-centered interventions. Some people ask me, would it be a good idea to put an extra nurse in the clinic who just deals with adherence? Now, my answer to that is it's kind of the wrong question, right? It would be generally a good thing anywhere to have an extra nurse in a clinic, right? That's a general good, but doesn't necessarily mean that adherence would improve, because a nurse is a delivery vehicle for something. It also depends on the content. What does the nurse say and do? Another thing that happens, particularly in the industry that I've observed, is something I call the app trap, right? Which is where people want to do good stuff, and they think, how do we reach a lot of people in cheaply digital? So we'll develop an app. And it's the same thing, right? The app trap, the app of itself is just a delivery vehicle. What really counts is what does the app say and do with the patient. So we need to get both of those, right? Content and channel, but also context. And I'll explain what I mean by context. Let's briefly look at each of these in turn. So content. What we need to do is to start with motivation. People need to be motivated to do it. They need to think it's a good idea. They need to be able to do it. And once you have those two things in place, often people will then develop a healthy habit. How many of us get up in the morning and think, right, tooth brushing. What are my necessity beliefs? What are my concerns? Shall I do it? Not sure. No, we're already convinced we can do it. It becomes a healthy habit, right? But when it comes to medicine, all of us are going to be thinking, at least at the start and at points during the journey with the medicine, how much do I really need this? What are my concerns? Right? So the motivation comes first. Now, the other thing we need to recognize is patients often have two different ideas. I really like and trust this doctor, nurse, pharmacist, but I'm not sure I trust the medicine. Anyone recognize that? Problem is, that's completely hidden because patients will often think that if I express a doubt or a concern about the treatment, or I tell the doctor I'm not taking it, that will offend them. Okay? And they will think less of me as a patient. So often, non-adherence is under the iceberg, under the surface of the iceberg, because it's not declared or dealt with in consultations. So we have a three-step approach. This is what we need to do, right? And it's simple 3 steps, and this is in the NICE guidance, right? And we need to start with a no-blame approach that facilitates an honest and open discussion, right? Non-adherence is the norm. And we have to create that environment where the patient can tell us what their doubts and concerns are. And there are 3 points that we need to cover. These are the basic ingredients of any adherence solution. We need to communicate a story, right, which is a common sense rationale for why the treatment is needed, that takes account of patients' perceptions of the illness and their symptom expectations, and addresses the common question, why should I take this stuff when I feel well? or when I now feel better and my illness is controlled. These common sense defaults which often lie underneath doubts about necessity. We need to engage the patient and communicate the medicines in a way which speaks to their underlying beliefs so that they can make an informed choice, not a choice which is based on a misconception. I don't need it because I can't feel it working, right? We need to understand, draw out, and address people's concerns about the adverse consequences of treatment, including support with side effect management, not just telling them what to expect. And I'll talk a little bit about what that might look like. And then thirdly, because it is just a simple 3-step approach, we need to tailor a convenient regimen that makes it as easy and simple as possible, right? So that 3-step approach is distilled from all of this research. Now, how might we do that in practice? Let's talk about the concerns and side effects for a moment, right? There's often a disparity between the way in which doctors and patients think about side effects. And this is some early research in cancer, also some research in HIV, which really highlighted this, right? So what you'd see there is often what the doctor is looking for are the really severe clinical effects of the drug. So, for example, is there liver damage? Is it starting to damage the kidneys, right? And they would do tests, and they'd often say to the patient, great, you're doing fine on the medicine, based on these important tests. But what the patient is often thinking about are more subjective side effects, like how is this having to use this medicine affecting my family or partner? Loss of hair, fatigue, nausea, diarrhea, right? Fatigue being particularly important. And it's those subjective effects which the doctor may not be thinking, that's not serious, that's a small price to pay for the great effect you're getting from the medicine. But that is the stuff that is occupying the patient. And what we need to realize is that it's the patient perspective of side effects and how we support that we need to address. Now, what is a side effect? Some of the work that we've recently been doing is on the way in which our psychology directly affects the outcome of medicines. And one of the studies, some studies that we've done in HIV and rheumatoid, looking at how could we take a group of people and predict who's going to get side effects? They're all started on the drug. And the startling thing is the same beliefs that we measure that are related to adherence also predict side effects. So this is a study, mainly women with rheumatoid arthritis, and we measured their concerns about treatment at baseline before they started the treatment, and we separated them into 2 groups, low concern and high concern. And the ones who started out with high concerns had significantly more side effects. Some of those side effects could be tolerated, but some in the dark blue bar were so severe that they needed to change the drug. And you can see that's a massive predictor, is if you start off with concerns and about the treatment, you are more likely to experience and report side effects. And we saw exactly the same thing in a HIV study. So what's going on here? Well, if you look at what are the common side effects to a medicine, they're the same across most medicines: nausea, headache, fatigue, right? They're also the symptoms that you see in the placebo arm of clinical trials, and they're also the most common symptoms that people describe if you say, what symptoms have you had in the last 2 weeks? And what we think is going on here, and we've done other studies to test this, is if you start out with concerns and you look at the leaflet and it says fatigue, headache, and then you experience these symptoms, you are much more likely to blame the medicine, right? And then what people to think it's the medicine and it's doing damage to my body. And then rather than discuss that and say, look, is there something I can do about this? You're much more likely to just drop out of treatment, to say, oh, I don't want to discuss this with a doctor. This is obviously poison. That's it for me, right? And we can't blame people for doing that. because we kind of leave them alone to manage that stuff often within the healthcare system, right? So what we're now developing and working with some industry partners to try and deliver this as part of patient support programs, and we'd like to do this kind of stuff in cancer, is to start thinking in a different way about side effects and recognize there are three dimensions: the human impact of side effects. Firstly, the physical. And we're pretty good at this. You know, if patients get diarrhea, we can give them treatments that slow that down. And we often focus in that area. But actually, there's a massive psychological dimension to side effect. What does the person think is the meaning of that symptom? And often that is interpreted by the patient as, this is really damaging my body. This stuff is poison. For some medicines, it's a different way of looking at it. That's unpleasant, but it means the drug is having an effect. And often you can do something about that and it will get less over time, and you can manage those side effects to get the good effects of the treatment. And the third dimension is behavioral. How do we encourage people to talk about their side effects rather than simply drop out? So this is a program that we've developed called the 3Ds, 3 dimensions of side effects, which tries to take a patient perspective on them. Channels. We've shown that pharmacists can deliver this perceptions and practicalities approach. And in one study, could do it in a 12-minute call. We increased necessity beliefs, reduced concerns, had 50% higher adherence in the intervention arm, and fewer medication-related problems. Build slide. We've shown in another study, which was done in Belfast a couple of years ago, that this approach reduced hospital readmissions and reduced length of stay in those who were readmitted, and was cost effective to the NHS. For every £1 spent on the PAPA intervention, it generated a saving of £50 for the NHS. So that's saved. And more recently, to help bridge the app gap, we've developed a digital tool which can deliver a PAPA approach and actually change people's beliefs about medicines using an algorithm digital-based approach that we call Persignia. And that identifies patients' doubts about need, their concerns, and provides tailored support to address that. So from the patient's perspective, it feels really personalized, and many of the patients who fed back on this study said it felt like the questions that I've always had were now being answered. And we showed a significant increase in necessity beliefs relative to standard NHS care, and a significant reduction in concerns 3 months after the intervention. So we can now deliver this stuff in digital. You know, I'm as worried by artificial intelligence as anyone, and don't like it. This isn't that. This is designed as a triaging tool to integrate with the encounters with the healthcare provider. So it can help mop up some of the issues that the patient has, but it is not designed to replace the healthcare practitioner, but rather to support that interaction. And then context, finally, is very important. We need to be aware of cultural, social, and healthcare system factors that might mean that something that works really well in London might not work so well in Beijing. So usually the core of the intervention works anywhere because we're dealing with humans, but you usually have to adapt small nuances and aspects to take account of these cultural and health system factors. I'm going on too long, so I'm going to summarize now. And we're doing lots of studies, blah, 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 blah. So in summary then, right, we need to recognize that patients don't come as a blank sheet. We can write the prescription on. They come with ideas about the illness, beliefs and expectations of treatment. They're usually logical, but they can be mistaken. And they drive adherence, non-adherence. And taking account of them should be at the core of how we help patients get the best from medicines. And of course, we need to do product plus, right? A no-blame approach PAPA tailored to address motivation and ability. We can look beyond the clinic with tools like Persignia. We need communication aids to help clinicians with the interaction with patients around medicines. And I think that effective adherence support should be part of the value proposition. So this is for the healthcare system, but also pharma industry, who I think should be doing a lot more to bring this science into practice and support patients to get the best from their medicines. So thank you for listening. I'm sorry that that probably lasted 5 minutes longer than it should, but if we have time for questions, I'd be happy to address.
Is the question over here, Vandana? Yeah. Thank you, Rob. Fantastic talk.
I think it was an excellent presentation, but my concern is only one, that in India, in the government hospitals, a patient does not get more than 2 to 3 minutes with a doctor. So how do they sort out this problem, about the doctor explaining and the patient asking?
Okay. Yeah. So if I've understood your question, it's kind of like, this is all well and good, but you've only got 2 minutes with the doctor, right? So that's why we think that we need to look beyond the clinic. The doctor or the pharmacist has to be very much behind this and encouraging the patient to engage with the service. But the service can happen outside that consultation and can support it. So the 2 examples I gave of effective delivery were outside the medical clinic. The first was a pharmacist delivering it, and the second was the digital tool that can be used to reinforce and support what goes on in the clinic. So we're never going to be able to change that 2 minutes into 10 minutes. So what we need to do is to bring the support outside the clinic, but integrate it with the clinic so that the doctor is part of it and leading it, but it gets done, the action gets done outside. And if you think about it, most people's activity and experience of medicines happens outside the consultation. And so that's where we get the time.
But maybe just to comment on this, we see this is an increasing problem also in our healthcare systems, because there is so much pressure in the healthcare system that there is too less time for communication, conversation with the doctor. And in some healthcare systems, for example, in Germany, we don't have oncology nurses who could do this. That means we need to find better ways to support the patient. And be sure, we made this comparison, I think, some years ago. Every washing machine is coming with a better manual than a medicine. And this is the main issue. So we need to have a better support in information, but also in maintenance. And then there is a dramatic question for the healthcare system. What is the incentive of the doctor, of the healthcare system, to provide maintenance for this kind of therapy if he or she doesn't get any incentive for this? Because with the oral target therapies, there is no big incentive. They don't get a lot of money for doing a proper maintenance with the therapy. That's a big issue of the system, because in the moment when you do IV therapy, there is something like a maintenance fee in the IV therapy. So they're making money with the IV therapy. Exactly. But when it comes to the oral drugs, there is no incentive.
There's nothing.
And this is a huge problem.
So one of the things I think we need to look to in future, on my declaration slide, which I must apologize is missing because my fault, I sent an earlier version to be uploaded. But I've set up a company with the university as a partner, which is designed to try and work with the industry and other partners to bring the insights of this research into practical programs. And I think part of the answer here is that the pharma industry could be a lot more inventive about how it supports patients. So one of the things that interests Marcus and I is, how pharma and patient support groups and a behavioral science grouping could come together to develop solutions to this, which can then be delivered to patients. If I were in charge of the healthcare system, worldwide, which I'm never going to be, I'd say, right, okay, part of the price of a medicine is whether you have a really good evidence-based adherence program, right? And if you do, I'll pay more for that than some generic which has nothing, because I will get more value. Now, we need to somehow try and think about it in a more inventive way, right? That ticks the commercial boxes for the system, right? But delivers what patients need in terms of support. And it's crazy that we're not doing more there. So I think there's all to play for. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, I suppose linked to that last point, I'm interested what you see as the role of patient organisations or patient advocates in improving adherence, because we want patients to have better outcomes, we want them to have effective treatments, but we're also not healthcare professionals. And how do you see that role of that kind of peer-to-peer support?
Massive. So what I want to do, and Marcus and I would love to try this, right, is working with our outfit, which is called Spoonful of Sugar, after the Mary Poppins song, is what helps the medicine go down in the most delightful way, right, is a set of behavioral scientists plus the patient support group, right, works on, and an industry partner, hopefully funding it, right, works on the content of the program that can then be delivered through the patient support group, right? Because for the program to be worthwhile at all, it needs to connect with patients, right? And I think patient support groups are very trusted, and they know, they have an implicit understanding of the patient perspective. So in my view, they should be partners. The problem is the commercial model doesn't work to facilitate that, right? Typically what the industry does to deliver a support program is go to a big comms agency, who are often more like advertising agencies, who all say, yeah, we've got behavioral science, and engage them. And they do some good stuff, but they don't do this. So we need to change the model. Sorry, gentleman over there in the white shirt.
The problem that Raghuram described and the solution that you gave, we have been solving it because I, as a patient, have realized it when I was undergoing the treatment. So the way we are solving this problem is that we conduct weekly support group meetings. So in that, what happens is, so I address the problem that the patient only gets 2 to 5 minutes with the doctor, and they have like multiple questions in mind which they want to ask to the doctor, and they don't get the answers properly, or they don't have enough time to ask all the questions. So what we do is, as soon as the patient comes out of the OPD, we have a chat with them. We have a closely knit group in which we add that patient to the group, and the patient can ask their peers, like she said, the patient can ask the peers about this queries that they have, and if the peers have experienced the same thing, they can answer it according to their experience and their problems. And if the patient who still have doubts, they reach out to us. And what happens in the weekly support group meetings, we invite doctors, pathologists, dietitians. Every week some other medical expert comes to the support group meeting, and we collect all the questions that the patients have. And many a times the questions are very similar. So we group them together. We ask one common questions to the expert, and the answer that is given by the expert is being the patient is getting answered, or the queries that they have initially during the OPD. The answers are being like delivered to them. There is a delay, like it happens every week, so there's a delay of 4-5 days, but the patient is getting fulfilled with all the queries that they have in the patient support group.
So I do think that's an interesting model, and I think that peer support is a very important aspect in adherence support, but I don't think it replaces what I'm talking about, because there's one limitation, and that is it depends on the quality of the individual peer, and that peer may share an experience which doesn't connect with the patient. So it is a good thing, but it's a limited thing, and we need more than it. So I'm not arguing against it. I'm saying, normally you would incorporate something on that, but we need to go beyond it as well, in my view. It's that plus.
Okay.
So it's one
Question. I was just wondering,
Last question, because
I was just wondering, do you see a difference in pediatric patients and their adherence when a parent is in charge compared to an adult?
So I do quite a bit of work in this strange group, you know, the old adage, never work with animals or teenagers. And there is a sort of interesting dimension there. And the key, it's not a set age, but it's when the control of the administration of the medicine passes from the adult to the child. And that often happens, you know, anywhere between, 11, 12, 16, right? And what we find is that for pediatrics under 10s, for example, what you're really looking at there is driving adherence, is parent beliefs, okay? But then there comes a stage where it's down to it transfers to the child. And one of the key things that we need to look at there is the child's beliefs about the condition and the treatment. And key to that is the impact of that medicine on their sense of self, often ignored. How they think that medicine affects the way they see themselves and how others see them. And a crucial question is, does being on that medicine, visibly taking it or having it in your life, make you more or less attractive to people you want to be attractive to? And the answer is generally less. So you have to have a different story, and a very quick example of how we've done this is the example of asthma, where teenagers are often told, take this inhaled corticosteroid every day, because even if you only get symptoms once in a while, because you have a chronic disease. And the teenager's going, I don't have a chronic disease. I feel normal when I don't have my asthma symptoms. And I don't want to be a person who has to have a medicine every day. So it's a negative impact on sense of self. So we've rebranded asthma away from a chronic disease to people who have asthma, their lungs are overreactive. They react too strongly. It's like a friend who's just a bit too enthusiastic. But the bad news is with that puts your body out of balance, right? And that means that if you don't do anything about bringing it back into balance, you can get symptoms that come and go, but each one of those damages your lungs. So in the long term, you can get worse. All of that is medically accurate. And then we make a common sense fit between the condition, which is your lungs being out of balance, and the treatment. So the bad news is your lungs are out of balance. If you don't do something about it, it's a problem. The good news is you have the power to bring it back into balance. How do you do that? Nature's way. So we take medical corticosteroids, which are nature's way of restoring the balance within the body. Both of those are medically accurate, and they tap into common sense defaults around yin and yang, the balance in the body. Is much more acceptable to the teenagers to have a slightly out of balance in a chronic condition. And it taps into this idea that the medicine is working with nature, not against it, which counteracts those common sense defaults about chemicals bad, natural good. So yeah, teenagers, very important, but there are things you can do.
So thank you very much. It was such a pleasure and such a value to have you here. So thank you very much.